I want you to picture something right now, and I really want you to be honest with yourself as you visualize this. You walk out the front door of your house or your apartment this morning.
Right.
You step onto a smoothly paved road. You pull out your phone, which is, instantly connected to a high-speed cellular network. You maybe browse a few global news sites before getting into your car.
All very standard stuff.
Exactly. And then you drive to a massive big box store where the shelves are literally lined with products from every corner of the globe. You pay with a tap of your plastic card or, a digital wallet. Everything is seamless.
It feels like magic, really.
It does. Everything is instant. When you look around, it feels incredibly advanced. It feels like the absolute pinnacle of human development. We have centralized utilities, digital permits, immediate access to almost anything we could ever want with zero friction. But, and this is the big question for today, what if the very things that make your community look so developed on paper are the exact same things that make it terrifyingly fragile in reality?
That is exactly the illusion the authors in today's stack of sources are attempting to shatter. We have a really a fascinating collection of material to go through for this deep dive.
We really do.
We're looking at excerpts from several provocative texts. We've got Building Immunity Through Decentralized Infrastructure, Resurgence of the Resilient Town, The Architecture of Steady Momentum.
Which is a great title, by the way.
It really is. We also have The Blueprint for Civic Longevity, The Human Infrastructure of Sustainability, and finally, The Moral Architecture of Green Stewardship. These texts collectively challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying modern municipal development.
They aren't just critiquing the current system, right? They are offering a completely alternative framework for what a town should actually be.
Exactly.
And the mission of this deep dive is to explore how these sources completely reframe how you might think about the concept of a green town. Let's be honest, when most of us hear the phrase green town or sustainable community, our minds immediately go to a very specific aesthetic or even a political ideology.
We tend to think of environmental idealism, right? Expensive electric vehicles or highly stylized eco-architecture that looks great in a magazine but feels entirely disconnected from everyday life.
Yeah, totally. But these sources strip all of that away. They make the case that a green town is not about idealism at all. They reframe it as literal survival.
It's about cold, hard risk management. Building an immune system for your community before the next systemic shock hits.
The overarching argument across all these sources is that our current municipal and logistical systems operate on an assumption of permanent stability.
Yes, we build zoning laws and infrastructure, assuming the trucks will always arrive on time, the municipal water pressure will always remain constant, and the regional grid it'll always hum.
But the moment you analyze the underlying mechanics, as these authors do, you realize how incredibly brittle these systems actually are.
The transition these texts are advocating for is moving from a state of fragility to a state of anti-fragility.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the very first concept in these sources really sets the stage. There is a line in Building Immunity Through Decentralized Infrastructure that states, and I quote, "Advancement without redundancy is exposure."
It's a heavy line.
It is, but I want to push back on the author's premise here for a second, just to play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Because centralization happened for a reason.
Absolutely.
We centralized our power grids and water treatment facilities because of economies of scale. It is vastly cheaper and supposedly more efficient to have one massive plant serving 1 million people than 1,000 microplants serving 1,000 people each. Does the text actually address the massive upfront cost of abandoning that centralized efficiency to build local redundancies?
It does, and it approaches that exact pushback by redefining how we calculate cost and efficiency. The author argues that what we call efficiency is actually just the stripping away of buffers.
So we traded safety for cheapness.
Basically, yes, a highly centralized utility grid managed hundreds of miles away is incredibly cost-effective on a quarterly balance sheet. But that financial efficiency is purchased at the cost of operational redundancy.
Right.
The text points out that many municipalities right now are operating on razor-thin margins of safety. We're talking about aging water systems and overburdened electrical grids that are perfectly calibrated for a very narrow band of optimal conditions.
So the argument is that they are highly efficient right up until the exact moment they fail catastrophically.
Precisely. The text refers to this as the multiplier of centralized failure.
The multiplier.
Yes, the mechanics of fragility dictate that when everything flows from a single centralized node, failure doesn't just isolate itself, it cascades.
If a town relies entirely on one massive water treatment plant, and that plant goes offline due to a grid failure or, say, a cyber attack,
The entire town loses water simultaneously. There is absolutely no backup. The centralization that made the system so economically advanced is exactly what guarantees a community-wide collapse when the system is stressed beyond its narrow operating parameters.
which brings us to the logistics models that currently run our towns. I mean, we don't need to spend time explaining that a power outage stops gas pumps. We all know the basics of a blackout.
Right, everyone has experienced that.
But the texts go much deeper into the statistical fragility of just-in-time supply chains. The modern municipal economy relies on algorithmic efficiency, where stores keep virtually zero backstock. They rely on global shipping networks functioning perfectly every single day.
The author argues that this isn't an advanced economy at all. It's a high-wire act without a net.
And this leads to a really interesting historical perspective introduced in the text, Resurgence of the Resilient Town.
Oh, the memory recovery concept.
Yes, they introduce this concept called memory recovery. They posit that there was a time, and historically speaking, not that long ago, when towns operated as closed-loop ecosystems.
They weren't just geographical locations where people slept and occasionally shopped. They were living, functioning networks comprised of healthy soil, local water sources, localized agriculture, and neighbor-to-neighbor trade.
A town was not something you simply drove through on your way to somewhere else. It was something you actively participated in.
That distinction is vital to their entire argument. The text suggests that over the last century, we have systematically outsourced our local resilience.
We outsourced our survival.
Exactly. We shifted from a production-based local economy to a strictly consumption-based one. Food arrives via complex logistical networks we have zero visibility into. Water flows from massive municipal systems we do not control. Power is generated by centralized corporate grids.
The author argues that we have fundamentally shifted our relationship with our environment, becoming mere consumers of place rather than caretakers of it.
Consumers of place instead of caretakers. That is such a stark framing.
It really is, and it forces a question for you, listening right now. How do you interact with your own town? Are you a consumer of your neighborhood, or are you a caretaker?
That's the real test.
Are you essentially just paying a subscription fee, your rent, or your property taxes, and expecting flawless services to be delivered to your door? Or are you actively involved in the ecosystem of that place?
Because the authors of these texts are arguing that our modern identity as passive consumers is exactly what leaves us so statistically vulnerable.
If you are strictly a consumer, and the supply chain stutters, your options drop to zero immediately. You have no recourse.
And that transition from passive consumer back to active caretaker is the essence of what the sources mean by memory recovery. They are very careful to note that this isn't about Luddism.
Right, we're not throwing away our phones.
No, it's not about abandoning modern medicine or the internet to go churn butter in the woods. It's about recovering the structural memory of distributed strength. It's asking a highly pragmatic question. What if we choose to build resilience into our local culture now, rather than scrambling to invent it as a desperate, chaotic reaction to a systemic shock?
Which perfectly sets up the core philosophy of this entire deep dive. There is a specific passage in the sources that synthesizes this argument, and it completely pivots the standard conversation around urban planning.
Let's hear it.
The text states, and I want you to really listen to the phrasing here, a green town is not built in crisis. It is built before crisis arrives. It is built by people who recognize that sustainability is not ideology, it is stability. The future will not reward the most reactive communities. It will reward the most prepared. And preparedness begins at home, but it does not end there.
That passage is really the anchor of the author's entire thesis.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it efficiently strips away the cultural baggage that usually accompanies the word sustainability.
For decades, the conversation around going green has been heavily politicized in almost every municipality. It gets framed either as a moral crusade, an environmental ideology, or a luxury initiative for high-income zip codes.
Right, and it immediately triggers defensive political posturing depending on which side of the aisle you sit on. And we need to be clear, we are just presenting the source material here. We aren't taking sides on those political debates.
Absolutely. We are just looking objectively at the text.
But the author makes a really bold structural argument here by stating sustainability is not ideology, it is stability. They are attempting to remove the politics entirely and replace ideological debate with cold, objective risk management.
The argument is essentially this. It doesn't matter what your political affiliation is. The laws of physics and logistics dictate that you need water, you need caloric intake, you need power, and you need your community to not dissolve into chaos when external systems fail.
By redefining sustainability as stability, the authors reframe a green town simply as a town that is statistically prepared to survive.
Let's look closely at the contrast the text draws between reactive communities and prepared communities.
Okay.
A reactive municipal government waits for the 100-year flood event, suffers massive infrastructure damage, applies for federal emergency funds, and then tries to rebuild the exact same fragile systems, perhaps just pouring a slightly higher concrete seawall.
They just reset the trap.
Exactly. A prepared community, according to this framework, looks at the shifting probability models, recognizes the vulnerability, and builds the decentralized infrastructure like restoring natural wetlands or engineering distributed stormwater management before the first drop of rain even falls.
But the text, the blueprint for civic longevity, points out a massive structural hurdle to this kind of preparedness, which is the nature of municipal governance itself.
The time horizon problem.
Yes. They point out that most towns plan their infrastructure around the fiscal year, or at best, a 4-year election cycle. Very few are genuinely planning for the next half-century. We are pouring concrete and laying pipes that will be in the ground for 80 years, but the decision-making matrix is limited to a 12-month budget cycle.
And the author argues that while municipal councils are staring at next year's budget variances, the underlying realities of the globe are undergoing seismic shifts. We are looking at shifting climate patterns, massive population migrations, accelerating technological disruptions, and rapidly reconfiguring global supply chains.
The communities that will successfully navigate these global transitions won't be the ones that react the fastest. They will be the ones that engage in long-term, decentralized planning. They view green design fundamentally as future-proofing.
There's also a massive financial argument here that the author makes, which completely flips the standard green is too expensive narrative. The sources explicitly argue that sustainability is not an operating expense, it is a reduction in future liabilities.
That is the crucial economic pivot in the text. If you view a decentralized system like swapping out standard concrete for permeable pavements that absorb rain, or installing bioswales to naturally filter runoff as just a green initiative, it looks like an optional, expensive line item on a budget.
Right, it looks like a luxury.
But if you analyze it through the lens of liability reduction, the math changes completely. The text gives incredibly clear examples. The capital required to prevent a flood through green infrastructure is vastly lower than the capital required to repair a town after a flood.
Establishing a robust community garden and local agriculture network is infinitely cheaper and more reliable than attempting to set up emergency food distribution during a prolonged supply chain collapse.
Building highly walkable communities where residents aren't completely dependent on personal vehicles reduces long-term municipal healthcare costs by organically promoting active lifestyles and reducing localized air pollution.
So under this framework, a green town isn't about winning an environmental award or looking aesthetically pleasing. It is a matter of ruthless fiscal responsibility. It's the recognition that if your town's infrastructure cannot sustain itself during a period of external stress, it isn't actually a stable town. It is only temporarily functioning in optimal conditions.
Which leads us into the practical application of this philosophy. How does a town actually build that capacity to handle stress? The sources lean heavily on a biological metaphor here.
The immune system.
Yes, they talk about a town needing an immune system. When a healthy human body is exposed to a pathogen, the immune system localizes the threat and neutralizes it before it can cascade into systemic organ failure.
The author argues a town requires the exact same structural defense.
The real question, according to the text, isn't do we go green? The question is, do we engineer our community's immune system before a shock forces us to? And the text, building immunity through decentralized infrastructure, gets very specific about what this looks like practically.
This is an abstract theory. They list tangible, decentralized infrastructure models.
Let's go through the specific examples they outline. First, decentralized solar and microgrids.
When individual homes and neighborhoods generate and store their own power, it dramatically flattens the demand curve on the centralized grid. More importantly, if a regional substation goes offline, the neighborhoods equipped with solar and battery storage don't go dark. The failure is localized, not systemic.
Second, they highlight robust community agriculture. And these aren't framed as weekend hobbies. They are framed as critical caloric buffers.
They reduce a town's absolute dependency on distant agricultural logistics. If a trucking route is disrupted, a town with a strong local food network still maintains a baseline of food security.
They also heavily emphasize localized water management. If a significant percentage of homes in a neighborhood utilize rain capture systems like cisterns, that radically reduces the volume of stormwater runoff that typically overwhelms municipal sewer systems during severe weather events,
which directly mitigates localized flooding.
Conversely, it reduces the strain on the treated municipal water supply during drought conditions. They mention local composting programs, which dramatically reduce the immense financial and logistical burden on the town of hauling thousands of tons of heavy organic waste to distant landfills.
And of course, walkable urban planning. If there is a massive spike in global energy prices or a localized fuel shortage, a town where residents can safely walk or cycle to the grocery store, the pharmacy, and their jobs is insulated from that shock in a way a sprawling, car-dependent suburb simply isn't.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what the author is really talking about is the deliberate engineering of diversity. The text states that the most robust towns of the future won't necessarily be the ones with the most technologically advanced central AI managing their traffic lights.
They will be the towns most diversified in how they source their absolute essentials. The author categorizes this into the 4 pillars of diversity: energy diversity, food diversity, economic diversity, and skill diversity.
Energy, food, economic, and skill. Let's really drill down into these because this is where the theory hits reality.
Let's do it.
If your town relies 100% on natural gas pumped from a pipeline 3 states away, your energy diversity coefficient is 0. You are entirely exposed.
If you rely entirely on 3 major corporate grocery chains whose regional distribution centers are hours away and run on algorithmic just-in-time delivery, you have 0 food diversity.
And moving beyond just resources, economic diversity means a town's tax base and employment aren't entirely reliant on a single massive corporation or a single vulnerable industry.
Right. If that factory relocates or that industry becomes obsolete due to automation, the entire municipal economy doesn't collapse.
But perhaps the most interesting pillar they discuss is skill diversity.
Yes, this one is crucial. A truly resilient town has a population that retains practical knowledge. People who know how to cultivate crops, repair mechanical systems, provide basic medical triage, build physical structures, and manage raw resources.
A population that only knows how to perform highly specialized, abstract tasks in a digital economy is incredibly vulnerable if the digital layer goes down.
This is where the author's framework really shifts in my perspective. When you have these 4 pillars of diversity built into a decentralized municipal system, the very nature of a crisis changes.
The text argues that in a decentralized, layered system, a disruption is downgraded from a catastrophe to a mere inconvenience. That is a massive paradigm shift.
If one block loses power because a localized transformer blows, but the adjacent block operates on a decentralized microgrid, the failure is contained.
The solar block is still functioning. They can run extension cords to keep medical equipment running. They can keep refrigerators cold. They serve as a stabilized staging ground for repairs.
Exactly. It creates a localized buffer. Fragility is defined by a lack of buffers. When global supply chains break in a highly fragile, optimized system, the grocery shelves empty in hours and public panic sets in almost immediately.
When severe weather hits, centralized systems stall completely.
But in a community that has cultivated the capacity to grow, repair, trade, and share locally, there's a massive built-in shock absorber. Yes, the external disruption is annoying, it's economically inconvenient, but the fundamental social and physical structure of the town doesn't collapse.
And I think it's crucial to clarify a point that the sources make very explicitly here, to prevent any misunderstanding of their intent. A green town, under this definition, is not anti-technology.
We aren't talking about retreating to an agrarian past.
No. The text explicitly states, a green town is not anti-technology. It is anti-fragility. It is about leveraging advanced technology smartly to distribute capability rather than using technology to centralize vulnerability.
That's a vital distinction.
Yeah.
High-efficiency solar panels are advanced technology. Permeable bioswale engineering is advanced technology. Microgrid management software is advanced technology.
But they are deployed as technologies of anti-fragility. They push power, water management, and logistical capability down to the edges of the network, to the individual household and the neighborhood block, rather than hoarding all the capability at a single central node.
But all the technology in the world, all the solar panels and perfectly engineered rain barrels don't mean anything if we ignore the next major theme of these sources.
And this is a hard pivot to what the texts refer to as the most overlooked form of sustainability, human infrastructure.
The human infrastructure of sustainability.
Hmm.
This is arguably the most profound and perhaps the most challenging argument in the entire stack of sources.
The author boldly states that true sustainability is not just about managing land and resources. It is fundamentally about managing relationships.
You can engineer the most perfectly decentralized, ecologically harmonious, technologically advanced town on Earth, but if the people living within it operate as entirely isolated individuals who don't know, trust, or communicate with each other, that community remains incredibly weak.
The text puts it incredibly bluntly. It says, isolation weakens communities faster than pollution ever could. I want you to really let that sink in. Isolation weakens communities faster than pollution ever could.
A striking thought.
If you have an immaculate, LED-certified, zero-carbon footprint neighborhood, but you don't know the first or last name of the person living 20 feet away from you, you are living in a fragile neighborhood.
Because when residents operate as entirely disconnected, atomized units, the capacity for collective strength simply vanishes. Any effective crisis response requires immediate, frictionless cooperation. It requires baseline trust.
If there is a localized emergency, a flash flood, a prolonged power grid failure, a widespread medical event, you cannot rely solely on professional, centralized emergency services. They will be mathematically overwhelmed almost instantly.
In the critical first 72 hours of any major disruption, your immediate safety, comfort, and survival will depend almost entirely on the people physically closest to you, your neighbors.
The sources outline what this human infrastructure actually looks like in practice, and I have to admit, it challenges modern social norms. It's not just the polite, socially distant wave across the street. The text calls for functional connection.
It lists specific practical actions, tool-sharing networks, for instance. The author asks rhetorically, why does every single house on a suburban street need to individually own their own heavy-duty pressure washer, extension ladder, and lawnmower that sits unused 95% of the time?
They suggest skill exchange networks, childcare co-ops, localized emergency support protocols, thriving local farmers markets that serve as social hubs, not just transactional points, shared neighborhood repair days.
These activities are not just quaint community-building exercises. They are the literal mechanisms by which structural trust is forged. The author points out that trust isn't an abstract emotion you can just will into existence during a crisis. It is an asset built through repeated, mutually beneficial, low-stakes interactions over time.
When you swap childcare duties with a neighbor, or when you organize a neighborhood cleanup, or when you purchase vegetables directly from the person who grew them down the road, you are weaving a resilient social fabric.
And the text emphasizes that if you install $20,000 worth of solar panels on your roof, but you view your neighbors with suspicion and isolation, your social fabric will still fracture under the pressure of a real crisis. The hardware of resilience, the physical green infrastructure, must be animated by the software of resilience, the human infrastructure.
There is a line in this section that really stuck with me. Planting trees is powerful, but planting trust is transformative. The author is arguing that environmental restoration and social restoration are deeply, inextricably intertwined.
You cannot logically sustain a healthy, stable physical environment if the human community residing within it is socially toxic, fragmented, and isolated.
This leads the author to propose a radical shift in how municipal governments measure the success of their initiatives. Right now, when a city council announces a new sustainability plan, they typically measure success through highly quantitative ecological metrics. Tons of carbon reduced, kilowatts of renewable energy added to the grid, or cubic yards of waste diverted from the local landfill.
Those are certainly important operational metrics. But the sources argue that the most robust, stable towns of the future will adopt a new primary metric. They will measure participation.
Measuring participation. Imagine a city council meeting where the primary question isn't just about budget variances, but asking, what percentage of our residents are actively enrolled in a neighborhood resource sharing network? What percentage are actively attending local skill building workshops?
Because as the text concludes on this specific point, when people feel ownership over their community, they protect it.
If you view yourself strictly as a consumer, you don't fight to protect the big box store when the roof leaks. You simply take your money to a different store. But if you are a participant, an owner, an active caretaker of a local ecosystem, you will expend massive effort to sustain and repair it.
And that psychological transition from passive consumer to active caretaker certainly doesn't happen overnight. Which brings us to the concept of steady momentum, detailed in the text, the architecture of steady momentum.
The author identifies a major psychological barrier for citizens when they are presented with the need for systemic urban change, which is the profound feeling of overwhelm.
An individual looks at the staggering fragility of the global logistical supply chain or the massive vulnerabilities in the national power grid, and they naturally think, I am completely powerless to fix that. That requires a multi-trillion-dollar federal overhaul.
Right, the scale of the problem induces paralysis. But the text aggressively pushes back against that kind of defeatism. It argues that meaningful green transformation does not require, and in fact shouldn't wait for, massive centralized federal mandates to begin.
It begins highly locally. It begins with micro shifts that generate compounding power. The author's mantra here is that true sustainability is not loud or flashy. It is quiet and it is steady.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of this steady momentum because the text provides a very clear, almost sociological progression of how microactions scale up to macro-level systemic change.
It argues that it starts the accumulation of disciplined, consistent actions by ordinary citizens, actions that in isolation seem incredibly mundane and statistically insignificant.
Setting up a backyard compost bin to reduce municipal waste weight, installing a simple rain barrel, ripping out a water-intensive, chemically treated lawn, and planting a native, drought-resistant garden.
Making the deliberate choice to repair a broken mechanical appliance instead of tossing it and buying a cheap replacement. Choosing to buy a percentage of groceries from a local grower instead of a globalized supermarket chain. Showing up to a mundane Tuesday night town zoning meeting.
I really appreciate how granular and accessible that list is, but the crucial part of the author's argument is the snowball effect. The text walks us through the mathematical progression.
A single household adopting these resilience practices. Yes, in the grand scheme of a fragile global logistics network, one household's compost bin is a statistical rounding error.
But the author points out that human beings are highly mimetic, social creatures. It rarely stops with one household. When you build that native garden, your immediate neighbor sees it and asks about the water bill. When you start successfully sharing expensive tools, the neighbors on your block experience the immediate financial benefit.
Exactly. The progression the author outlines is structural. 10 households adopting these practices together create local momentum. When an entire street begins functioning as a shared network, that neighborhood creates a distinct culture.
And culture is an incredibly powerful, deeply ingrained force.
Once a culture of local reliance, ecological awareness, and shared resilience is established across a few neighborhoods, it inevitably begins to influence broader municipal policy. City councils and zoning boards eventually respond to organized, culturally aligned, highly participatory neighborhoods.
The author's thesis is that large, centralized systems only change when a sufficient number of small, decentralized systems shift beneath them, altering the foundation.
Greentown is not a fantasy city built from scratch by visionary architects. It is an accumulation of disciplined, consistent actions by ordinary people who simply refuse to remain passive.
That is a highly empowering structural framing. It shifts the locus of control. You don't have to wait for a savior politician to pass a magical, comprehensive piece of legislation. You initiate the process by refusing to be a passive consumer in your own backyard and on your own street. Because steady, culturally embedded movements, as the text notes, are the only ones that actually endure over the long term.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize all of this, what does it ultimately mean for how we build our communities? We've spent a lot of time discussing the practical logistics, the decentralized microgrids, the bioswales, the localized supply chains, the tool-sharing networks.
But the final source in our stack, the moral architecture of green stewardship, elevates this entire conversation from pure municipal logistics to deep philosophy. It asks us to consider a much older, more profound question. What does it actually mean to live on a piece of land responsibly?
This is where the text introduces the ethics of stewardship. Now, the author notes that stewardship is an ancient concept, but one that has been severely neglected, if not entirely abandoned, in modern civic planning.
The concept of stewardship is based on a very humbling foundational assumption. We do not permanently own the land we inhabit. We are merely borrowing it, temporarily managing it for those who will come after us.
And the author argues that adopting that concept completely upends the modern municipal development model. They argue that the prevailing civic model of the last century has been strictly defined by growth for growth's sake.
It is a model characterized by constant expansion without regeneration. It aggressively seeks short-term economic profit without accounting for long-term ecological restoration.
The standard operating procedure is, if there is a natural wetland, pave over it to build a sprawling shopping center, because that generates immediate quarterly tax revenue for the town. The massive long-term ecological and financial costs like increased flooding and water table depletion are simply externalized and pushed onto future generations of taxpayers.
The text poses several rhetorical questions that the author believes every town planner, zoning board member, and really every resident should be forced to answer.
They ask, should towns exist primarily to extract from their environment or to harmonize with it? Should short-term economic gain ever outweigh long-term ecological and social stability? What specific, tangible responsibility do current residents hold toward the residents who will live there 50 years from now?
When the author frames it through that lens, you realize their argument is that sustainability is not merely an operational choice. It is deeply ethical. Every infrastructural choice a town makes has a compounding, multi-generational effect.
Paving over a natural drainage area doesn't just solve a parking space issue today. It mathematically compounds the cost of flooding for the next 50 years.
Neglecting the urban tree canopy doesn't just save a few $1,000s on the municipal pruning budget this year. It compounds the cost of urban heat island effects and related health issues for decades.
Allowing unchecked, polluted runoff into local waterways destroys the water table for the people who will have to live there long after the current city council has retired.
It's a total rejection of municipal short-termism. And the author concludes this final text with what I think is a fascinating redefinition of what it actually means for a town to be successful.
We are so deeply conditioned by modern economics to think that a successful town is the one with the booming population graph, the most aggressive new commercial construction, the rapidly expanding geographic footprint.
But the text proposes a different standard entirely. Stewardship reframes success entirely. A successful town is not the one that expands the fastest, it's the one that degrades the least.
The one that degrades least.
That is a metric of genuine longevity. The author's concluding argument is that a town that expands wildly but systematically destroys its own aquifer, isolates its citizens in atomized subdivisions, and relies entirely on fragile, hyperextended global supply chains is not a successful town.
It is a town speeding toward a statistically inevitable collapse. Conversely, a town that grows slowly and deliberately fiercely protects its local ecosystems, intentionally builds deep human infrastructure and trust, and maintains functional decentralized redundancy, is a town equipped to endure whatever the future holds.
This has been an incredibly dense and thought-provoking stack of sources to explore. To try and summarize the core arguments we've unpacked today, true community resilience, according to these authors, is not about retreating to the past in some fit of agrarian nostalgia, and it's certainly not about adopting a superficial, highly aesthetic green marketing campaign.
It is about actively, pragmatically preparing for a highly unpredictable future. It's about recognizing the severe mathematical fragility of our centralized systems.
It's about intentional localizing vital resources, building physical and logistical redundancies into the fabric of our daily lives, and perhaps most importantly and most challengingly, relearning how to functionally rely on the people living right next door to us.
It's the recognition that true sustainability is simply stability, and that a green town is fundamentally an anti-fragile town.
And as we reflect on the frameworks presented in these texts, I want to leave you with a final, highly practical thought to mull over, building directly on the author's arguments regarding human infrastructure.
We've discussed the fragility of centralized systems. We've discussed the author's assumption that social isolation is a massive vulnerability. So I want you to run a mental simulation tonight.
Imagine that a severe, localized shock hits your town tonight. The centralized grid goes completely dark. There is no power. There is no internet. The municipal water pressure drops to zero. You are looking out your window at your street in the pitch black.
Ask yourself honestly, which of your immediate neighbors possesses a tangible skill, a tool, or a resource that could keep your street functioning for the next 72 hours? Who has the medical training? Who has a stored water supply? Who knows how to safely heat a space or secure a perimeter?
And more importantly, have you even bothered to introduce yourself to them yet? Because for all the complex talk of advanced green technology, microgrids, and grand municipal planning, true civic infrastructure might just start with a simple handshake across the fence.
It really might.
As we close out this deep dive, just a quick reminder that this is coming from Echoes from the Edge with the Lone Wolf podcast closing.